My name is Emily Carter. At 29, with the rank of captain in the Special Forces, people tend to think I'm fearless. They're wrong. My greatest fear was standing right in front of me, in my own pristine white wedding dress. It wasn't the man I was about to marry, but my father, Robert Carter, sitting in the front pew of St. Michael's Church in Charleston. He looked at me, not with a father's eyes, but with the cold, lifelong contempt of a man who saw only disappointment. And then, the doors burst open. A SWAT team stormed in. My father stood up, a triumphant smirk spreading across his face as he roared, "Arrest the bride! Did you really think I wouldn't find out about your lies?" The entire church fell silent, the humiliation like a fiery slap across my face. But my father didn't know one thing. He thought this was his play. In reality, he was just the star of mine. Let me know where you're watching from, hit that like button, and subscribe if you've ever been underestimated by your own family and believe that justice will eventually be served. The setting was a cruel kind of perfect. Our engagement party was held in the manicured gardens of a historic mansion south of Broad, one of those Charleston homes that drips with old money and secrets. The late spring air was thick and sweet with the scent of magnolias, a scent I used to love. A three-piece jazz band played softly near the fountain, their notes weaving through the polite laughter of our guests. Everything was perfect, a perfect lie. Standing beside Liam, his hand warm and steady in mine, I almost let myself believe it. In my ivory silk dress with the man I loved, I felt a flicker of genuine happiness, a dangerous emotion I'd learned to keep on a tight leash. Happiness made you complacent, and I could never afford to be complacent. Not in my world, especially not in his. I felt his presence before I saw him, like a cold front moving through the warm, humid air. My father, Robert Carter, was making his way towards us. He held a heavy crystal tumbler, half full of bourbon, the amber liquid catching the setting sun. The smile I'd been wearing for Liam tightened at the edges, becoming a piece of armor. My entire body went on alert. I knew the storm was coming. Liam felt it, too. His fingers gave my hand a gentle, reassuring squeeze. He knew. He didn't know the specifics, the years of carefully catalogued insults and dismissals, but he knew the tension that radiated from my father like heat off asphalt. Around us, the cheerful atmosphere seemed to congeal, the happy chatter of friends and family suddenly feeling distant and muffled. It was a brutal contrast, the beautiful, elegant surface of our lives and the rot that festered just beneath, in the heart of my own family. It's a feeling I think a lot of people know all too well. He stopped in front of us, giving Liam a condescending pat on the shoulder. "An architect, huh? That's good, son. At least you built something real," he said, his voice a low rumble. Then his eyes swiveled to me. The fake warmth vanished, replaced by a familiar, dismissive sneer. He raised his voice just enough for the cluster of guests nearby to hear every single word. "Not like my daughter here, sitting behind a desk all day at Fort Bragg, playing war games with A4 paper." Each word was a sharpened blade, aimed with surgical precision. The air in my lungs turned to ice. My years of training, the grueling physical and mental toll of earning my rank, the lives that depended on the decisions I made from that desk, all of it was reduced to a child's game. He wasn't done. I always dreamed she'd follow in my footsteps, become a real police officer, carry on the legacy. He sighed, a dramatic, theatrical sound of disappointment. But, well, at least she found a good man to take care of her. That was it, the final twist of the knife. He didn't just dismiss my career, he erased my strength, my independence, and painted me as a woman whose only remaining value was to be taken care of. I felt the heat rise in my cheeks, the public humiliation stinging worse than any physical wound. I could feel the uncomfortable glances from our guests, the pity in their eyes. But as my father basked in his moment, drunk on the power he wielded over my emotions, he made a fatal mistake. He turned to Colonel Miller, my commanding officer, who was standing nearby. My father only knew him as an old friend of the family, a convenient guest to impress. "Don't you worry, Colonel," he boasted, his voice slurring slightly from the bourbon. I'm having some of my old friends at the department pull this Liam fella's file. Can't trust anyone these days, you know. Have to check them out, down to the last detail. A profound, deadly silence fell over our small group. The jazz music seemed to stop. In his arrogant haze, my father had no idea what he had just done. He hadn't just insulted my fiancée. He had just confessed his intent to commit a federal crime, illegally accessing protected information, in front of a senior officer of the United States Army. For me, something inside shifted. This was no longer a personal slight. It was no longer about a daughter's hurt feelings. This was a security threat. This was an active, unacceptable risk. My eyes met Colonel Miller's across the space of a few feet. He gave me a barely perceptible nod. His expression was calm, unreadable, but I saw it all in his eyes: acknowledgement, understanding, and authorization. No words were necessary. A decision had been made. An operation was now in motion. I turned back to my father, forcing the muscles in my face to form a smile. It felt cold and alien on my skin. "You've always been so careful, Dad," I said, my voice even and smooth, betraying none of the glacial fury solidifying in my gut. But inside, the hurt daughter was gone. In her place, Captain Carter was assessing a threat. I looked at the man who gave me life, and I no longer saw a father. I saw a target. I analyzed his arrogance, his overconfidence, his careless speech, all vulnerabilities to be exploited. My silence wasn't weakness. It was the calm, patient focus of a predator that has just locked onto its prey. And as I watched him, basking in his perceived victory, a cold, clear question formed in my mind. Was this it? Was this the final straw? Sleep didn't come that night. The question my mind had formed at the party, was this the final straw, kept echoing in the silence of the bedroom, sharp and insistent. It wasn't a single drop that overflowed the glass. It was the pressure of 1,000 moments, a lifetime of being weighed and measured and always, always found wanting. Liam was asleep beside me, his breathing deep and even, a peaceful anchor in my storm. I slipped out of bed, pulling on a pair of jeans and a sweatshirt. The cool night air of Charleston did nothing to quiet the noise in my head. I got in my truck and drove, the familiar streets a blur of Spanish moss and gas lamps. I ended up at the one place that held all the evidence of my long, losing battle, the climate-controlled storage unit I rented on the outskirts of town, a room full of broken expectations. Inside, under the harsh fluorescent lights, I found the old wooden chest my grandfather had made. The hinges creaked as I lifted the lid, releasing the scent of cedar and old paper. The chest was a museum of my childhood, a collection of artifacts that told a single, painful story. On top lay a yellowed newspaper clipping from the Post and Courier, dated from when my father was first promoted to commissioner. A proud photo of him, smiling and confident, a man at the peak of his power. Shoved into a corner of the chest, almost as an afterthought, was a small velvet bag. I emptied its contents into my palm. A dozen swimming medals, mostly first place from my high school career. They felt cold and cheap. I remembered the day I broke the state record in the 200-meter freestyle. I'd run to him after the race, dripping chlorinated water on the pool deck, my chest aching with pride. He'd glanced at the gold medal hanging around my neck, his expression unchanged. "That's nice," he'd said, his voice flat. "But when are you going to do something that actually matters?" That question became the soundtrack of my life, a constant humming reminder that nothing I did would ever be enough. The medals, the academic awards, the commendations from my training, they were all just nice trifles. Because in his world, there was only one thing that mattered: the Carter legacy. My father was obsessed with it, and to him, that legacy had a name: Police Chief David Carter. His own father, my grandfather. A World War II hero from the Battle of the Bulge, a man who came home and built a reputation for integrity that was legendary in Charleston. Robert worshipped his memory, but he'd twisted it into a weapon. "Your grandfather would be so disappointed to see you now," he would say, his voice thick with judgment whenever my path diverged from the one he'd laid out. He'd say it when I chose military history over criminal justice, when I excelled at long-distance running instead of joining the police athletic league. But that wasn't the grandfather I remembered. My grandfather was the one who took me out to the marsh to teach me how to shoot his old service revolver. He's the one who spread topographic maps across the living room floor and taught me how to read the land. "Your mind, Emily," he told me, tapping my forehead with his finger, "is the most powerful weapon you'll ever carry. Don't let anyone, especially not a man who underestimates you, convince you otherwise." He saw me. He saw my potential, not as a carbon copy of the men before me, but as myself. My father's distorted version of him felt like the cruelest betrayal of all, turning a legacy of love into a whip to flay my self-worth. The memory that cut the deepest came unbidden. My 18th birthday. I had just been accepted to West Point. I knew he wouldn't be happy, but I held on to a sliver of hope that he'd see the honor in it, the service. I told him the news at the dinner table. He didn't yell. He didn't say a word. He just quietly stood up, placed his napkin on the table, walked into his study, and shut the door with a soft, final click. The silence was louder than any shouting match. Later that evening, my mother came to my room. She held a small, poorly wrapped gift box. "This is from your father," she whispered, as if she were delivering contraband. I opened it. Inside, nestled in tissue paper, was a cheap fountain pen, the kind you buy in a pack of 3 at a drugstore. "He said," she stammered, unable to meet my eyes. "He said, logistics officers need pens." A logistics officer. He had already decided my fate in his mind. Not a leader, not a soldier on the front lines, but a clerk, a paper pusher. The cold, calculated contempt packed into that cheap little gift was more devastating than any blow. It was a clear, unspoken message. Your dream is worthless. You are worthless. The weight of it all pressed down on me, there in the sterile light of the storage unit. I closed the chest, the creak of the hinges sounding like a final groan of surrender. But it wasn't over. I drove to one last place, Magnolia Cemetery. The air was still and quiet here, the old oaks draped in moss standing like silent sentinels over the dead. I found his grave easily, a simple marble headstone that read, David Carter, husband, father, chief, a man of honor. I stood there, the wind whispering through the trees, and I spoke to him, my voice barely a whisper. "Grandpa, Dad is tarnishing everything you built, everything you stood for. What do I do?" And in the silence, his own words came back to me, as clear as if he were standing beside me. "Honor isn't in the badge, Emily. It's in your actions." In that moment, standing before the grave of the one man who had truly believed in me, the years of sadness and hurt finally burned away, leaving something hard and clear in their place: determination. My father had spent my entire life trying to break me with his definition of legacy. He had no idea he had given me the very tool I needed to fight back. I would not let him destroy my grandfather's real legacy. I would not let him destroy my future. I would act, not for revenge, for honor. It was a silent vow, made under the stars in a place of ghosts and memories, but it was stronger than any oath I had ever sworn. If you've ever felt like you weren't good enough for a parent, no matter how hard you tried, please support this story by hitting the like button. And in the comments, just type one word: honor. Let them know what truly matters. The vow I made at my grandfather's grave wasn't left to hang in the quiet cemetery air. It settled deep inside me, a core of cold, hard resolve. But I didn't have to wait to act on it. My other world came calling first. It happened at 0300 hours. My personal phone doesn't ring with a melody. It vibrates with a harsh, coded buzz, a sound designed to cut through the deepest sleep. I reached for it on the nightstand, my movements practiced and silent. The screen glowed with a single word: Olympus. It was Colonel Miller. "Valkyrie, we have a situation." His voice came through the encrypted line, calm and clipped. No preamble, no wasted words. That was all it took. In an instant, Emily Carter, the fiancée, the daughter, evaporated. I slid out from under the warm covers, careful not to wake Liam. He mumbled something in his sleep and rolled over, completely unaware. I moved through the darkness of our bedroom like a ghost, my feet finding their way without a sound. I pulled on my tactical gear, the familiar feel of the ripstop fabric and the solid weight of the equipment, a strange kind of comfort. Before I left, I paused by the bed. In the faint moonlight filtering through the blinds, I could see Liam's face, so peaceful and untroubled. I leaned down and pressed a light kiss to his forehead, a silent apology for the lies that kept him safe. To him, my prearranged excuse was that I was heading out for an early morning inventory check at a secure warehouse. A bland, boring lie to cover a world of violence and consequence he could never know. As I slipped out the door, the weight of that deception settled on me, a familiar, heavy cloak. I was stepping out of his world and into mine. A world of life and death. The drive to Fort Bragg was a transition. The quiet residential streets gave way to the sprawling, sterile efficiency of the base. Here, the rules were different. The stakes were absolute. Inside the Special Operations Command Center, the logistics officer my father mocked ceased to exist. Here, I was Valkyrie, commanding officer of ODA 7214. The room was a cavern of muted light and quiet intensity, the only sounds the hum of servers and the low murmur of analysts. The air crackled with controlled urgency. Ghost, my team sergeant and right hand, was already there, his scarred face grim. He handed me a tablet. "Ma'am," he said, his voice a low gravel. "Hostage situation. Yemen." My face became a mask of cold focus. The report was concise. An American aid worker, a doctor named Aris Thorne, had been taken from a makeshift clinic in a contested province. His captors were a local militant faction known for their brutality. I absorbed the data: satellite imagery, signals intelligence, human intel reports. My mind processed it all, filtering out the noise, identifying the threats, formulating a plan. There was no room for doubt here. No one questioned my authority or my capability. My voice, when I spoke, was the law. My judgment was the thin line between a successful rescue and a catastrophic failure. Here, I wasn't a disappointment. I was a leader, respected without question. This was the only place on Earth I could truly be myself. "Ghost, I want your team ready to move in 20, I commanded, my eyes scanning the live drone feed. "Intel says they're holding him in a fortified farmhouse, here." I pointed to a spot on the digital map. "We go in silent, under cover of darkness. Standard operating procedure." For the next 12 hours, I didn't move from my chair. I orchestrated the mission from half a world away, my mind a complex machine running a dozen scenarios at once. My heartbeat remained slow and steady, a practiced calm I'd honed over years of high-stress situations. My team's lives and the life of Dr. Thorne were in my hands. I watched their progress as green icons on a satellite map, listening to their clipped communications through my headset. Then, chaos. "Valkyrie, this is Ghost. We have a problem." His voice crackled in my ear. "The target is not at the primary location. I repeat, the asset has been moved." My blood ran cold. The intel was wrong. This was the commander's nightmare. The plan was compromised. A new report flashed on my screen. A possible secondary location, a cluster of buildings in a nearby village, but the intelligence was thin, unconfirmed. I had seconds to make a call. Abort the mission, and Dr. Thorne was likely a dead man. Changed the plan on the fly, and I was sending my men into a potential trap, risking all their lives on a guess. The crushing loneliness of command settled on my shoulders. In that moment, there was no one to turn to, no one to share the burden. The decision was mine alone. I thought of my grandfather's words. Sometimes the right thing to do is the hardest thing to do. I took a breath. "Ghost, proceed to secondary location," I said, my voice steady, betraying none of the turmoil inside me. "Exercise extreme caution. I want constant updates." The next hour was the longest of my life. The silence was deafening. Then, finally, Valkyrie, we have the asset. He's safe. I say again, asset is secure. A wave of relief so powerful it almost buckled me washed through my body. Mission successful. I drove home as the sun was beginning to bleed over the horizon, painting the Carolina sky in shades of pink and orange. I was bone-tired, running on nothing but adrenaline and caffeine, but my mind was clear. I stripped off my gear in the garage, hiding my sidearm and noticing the small dark bruises already forming on my arms from leaning against the console for hours. When I walked into the kitchen, Liam was there, making coffee. The familiar, comforting smell filled the air. He turned and gave me his warm, easy smile. "Rough night, honey?" he asked, his eyes full of sincere concern. "The usual," I replied, the lie tasting like ash in my mouth. "Just paperwork." He wrapped his arms around me, and I leaned into him, closing my eyes. I had just commanded a team of elite soldiers, made a life-or-death decision, and saved a man's life from thousands of miles away. But I could never share that victory, that terror, that truth, with the man I loved more than anything. This was the price of my two worlds, the cost of being Valkyrie. For the first time in a long time, I wasn't alone in my fight. The silent decision made at the engagement party now needed a voice, a plan. The next morning, I found myself standing outside Colonel Miller's office. His office wasn't like the sterile, uniform spaces of most military commanders. It felt more like a historian's study, a sanctuary. The walls were covered with antique maps of forgotten battlefields. Sunlight streamed through the large window, illuminating the worn leather of the chairs and a simple wooden plaque on the wall. It held a quote from Theodore Roosevelt. "Far better it is to dare mighty things, to win glorious triumphs, even though checkered by failure." It was a room where history was respected and difficult decisions were made. He was waiting for me. Two thick ceramic mugs of black coffee, strong enough to strip paint, sat on his desk. There was no small talk. He just gestured to the chair opposite him. "Talk to me, Valkyrie," he said, his voice calm and even. I laid it out for him. Not as a wounded daughter seeking sympathy, but as a senior officer reporting a credible threat. I was clinical, precise, removing all emotion from my voice. I detailed my father's actions at the party, his stated intent to illegally access a federal database, and the potential security risk he posed. Robert Carter's actions compromised my operational security and, by extension, that of other assets, I concluded, my tone level. He has become a liability that needs to be neutralized. Colonel Miller listened without interruption, his hands steepled under his chin. He looked at me, his gaze direct and unwavering. There was no pity in his eyes, no condescension. There was only respect. The kind of respect my father had denied me my entire life. "I've seen men like your father before, Emily," he said, the use of my first name feeling like a deliberate gesture of support. "Men poisoned by the power they used to have. In many ways, they're more dangerous than any enemy we face overseas. Their pride makes them predictable, but also reckless." He didn't ask if I was sure. He didn't tell me to reconsider, to think about the fact that this was my own father. He didn't lecture me about family. He trusted my judgment. Absolutely. He leaned forward, his expression hardening with purpose. "What do you need from me?" That simple question hit me with the force of a physical blow. It was more valuable than 1,000 words of encouragement. It wasn't just an offer of help, it was a blank check of trust, a confirmation of my authority, a validation of everything I had fought to become. For a moment, I felt a lump form in my throat, but I swallowed it down. This wasn't the time for emotion. This was the time for action. My next meeting took place far from the formal structure of Fort Bragg. It was at a dive bar just off post, a place with sticky floors, the smell of stale beer, and the quiet ghosts of soldiers who had come and gone. It was the kind of place where oaths of loyalty were sealed over cheap whiskey, and they meant more than any contract signed in a lawyer's office. Ghost was waiting for me in a dark corner booth. He nursed a bottle of beer, his scarred, impassive face making him blend into the shadows. I slid into the seat across from him. Again, I kept it brief, professional. I laid out the tactical situation, the need for a small, discreet team for a sensitive domestic operation. I didn't get into the emotional details. He didn't need them. He listened, his dark eyes never leaving my face. When I finished, he just nodded once. "Whatever you need, Captain," he said, his voice a low rumble. "My team is your team. We're ready." He paused for a beat, then looked down at his beer bottle, turning it slowly in his hand. "My old man was a piece of work, too," he added, his voice dropping even lower. "I get it." That was all he said. But in that small, gruff admission, a bond was forged that was stronger than any order I could give. His loyalty wasn't just duty. It was born from a shared understanding, from the silent brotherhood of those who had survived the wars, fought within their own homes. I knew then, with absolute certainty, that he would follow me into hell and back. I left the bar feeling a warmth spread through my chest, a feeling I hadn't realized I'd been missing so desperately. Hope. But the warmth turned to a familiar, chilling loneliness later that night. Liam and I were in the kitchen, making dinner together. The smell of garlic and basil filled the air, and for a few minutes, everything felt normal. We were just a couple, planning a wedding, building a life. Liam stirred the pasta sauce, his expression thoughtful. "You know, I think you should talk to your dad," he said, his voice full of the genuine, well-meaning kindness that I loved so much. "The wedding is so close, it would be good to get everything sorted out before then." I forced a smile, but it felt brittle. "I'll sort it out, honey. I promise." How could I explain it to him? How could I tell this good, decent man that sorting it out didn't mean reconciliation? It meant executing a tactical operation. I couldn't tell him his future father-in-law was a security threat I was actively planning to neutralize. The secret stood between us, a wall of glass, invisible but impenetrable. He pulled me into his arms, and I rested my head on his chest, listening to the steady beat of his heart. And in the safety of his embrace, surrounded by the man who was my future, I had never felt more alone. My real family, the one forged in trust and shared purpose, was waiting for my command. But I had to hide them, and the truest part of myself, from the man I was going to marry. With my allies in place, there was no hesitation. The vow I made at my grandfather's grave shifted from a whisper of hope to a concrete plan of action. We called it Operation Nightingale. A nightingale sings most beautifully just before the dawn, and my father's downfall would be the prelude to my new life. Sun Tzu's words echoed in my mind: "Know your enemy and know yourself, and you will not be imperiled in 100 battles." I knew my father's greatest weakness was not his temper, but his monumental arrogance, and I would use it to destroy him. The first phase began in a secure, windowless room at Fort Bragg, a sensitive compartmented information facility, or SCIF. My team's tech specialist, a young genius we called Hex, worked his magic. On his multiple screens, the internal database of the Charleston Police Department came to life. "Okay, Captain," Hex said, his fingers flying across the keyboard. "I'm creating the ghost file now." He built a digital breadcrumb trail, a fabricated profile under Liam's name. It was a masterpiece of subtle misinformation. It contained nothing concrete, nothing that could truly harm Liam's reputation, but was filled with vague, suggestive red flags, notes about questionable real estate transactions, a flag to investigate foreign contacts, a mention of a sealed juvenile record that never existed. Hex then placed the file under a low-level security classification, just secure enough to look important, but accessible enough for someone with old credentials and a sense of entitlement to pry open. My father wouldn't be able to resist the bait. "The trap is set," Hex confirmed, leaning back. "The file is laced with a silent tripwire. The moment it's accessed by an unauthorized user, it sends an alert directly to the FBI's Cyber Division and CPD's Internal Affairs. They'll have the user's IP address, login credentials, and a timestamp down to the microsecond. The digital trap was laid. Now, we had to prepare the physical one. My wedding venue, the historic St. Michael's Church, became my battlefield. Sprawled across a table in our briefing room was not a seating chart, but a tactical layout of the church. My team and I went over it like we were planning an embassy evacuation. "Ghost, you're the wedding videographer," I instructed, pointing to a position near the front of the nave. Your primary lens will have a direct, unobstructed line of sight on Robert Carter at all times. I want his face, his reactions, every detail. Ghost nodded, his expression unreadable. 2 more of our guys will pose as catering staff, I continued, marking the main entrance and a side exit. They'll handle surveillance and access control. Our communications hub will be the organist. The man was a former Army signals specialist who owed Miller a favor. He could play Bach's toccata and fugue with one hand and coordinate a multi-channel encrypted network with the other. Every detail of my wedding was weaponized. The placement of the floral arrangements provided cover. The guest list was vetted, not for social standing, but for strategic positioning. It was a perfect plan, cold, precise, and ruthless. I was turning the most sacred day of my life into a meticulously orchestrated sting operation. There was a bitter irony in it that I didn't allow myself to dwell on. Just as we were finalizing the last details, my personal phone rang. The caller ID showed a picture of my mother, smiling on a beach vacation. My stomach tightened into a knot. I motioned for my team to give me a moment and stepped into the hallway. "Hello, Mom," I said, my voice carefully neutral. "Emily, darling." Her voice was syrupy sweet, a tone she always used when she was about to ask for something, or worse, deliver a lecture disguised as concern. "I was just thinking about you. Your father. He's just worried about you, that's all. He can be a little hot-headed, but it's all because he loves you so much." I remained silent, letting her spin her web. "You're a daughter, Emily. You should be a little softer. Just apologize to him. For the family. Don't let your silly pride ruin this happy time for everyone." Every word was a carefully chosen instrument of manipulation, wrapped in the language of motherly love. But it wasn't love. It was cowardice. She wasn't protecting me. She was protecting her own fragile peace, the carefully constructed illusion of a perfect Charleston family. She was the warden of my father's prison, ensuring the walls held strong. And in that moment, her betrayal felt more profound, more painful than my father's open hostility. He was the storm, she was the quiet rot that weakened the foundations. I took a slow, steadying breath. The hurt was there, but it was distant now, separated from me by a wall of cold resolve. "Mom," I said, and I was surprised by how calm my voice was, how devoid of the old tremor of a daughter desperate for approval. "I will not apologize for being the person I am. I hope you and Dad will be there to witness me start my new life." I put a slight, deliberate emphasis on the word witness. It wasn't an invitation, it was a warning. A stunned silence met me from the other end of the line. Before she could recover, I ended the call. I stood in the empty hallway for a long moment, my own reflection staring back at me from the polished glass of a framed photograph. There was no more doubt. No more hesitation. The face looking back at me wasn't Emily Carter, the daughter, the fiancée. It was Valkyrie, a soldier about to enter the most important battle of her life. The day of the wedding arrived, cloaked in the deceptive beauty of a perfect Charleston morning. Standing in the bridal chamber of St. Michael's Church, I looked at my reflection in the tall, antique mirror. The woman staring back was a stranger in ivory lace and silk. She looked serene, ethereal, every bit the blushing bride. But her eyes told a different story. They weren't the eyes of a bride, they were the eyes of a soldier scanning the terrain, assessing every angle, waiting for the signal to advance. A soft whisper, barely audible, broke the silence. "Target has entered the sanctuary. All units, confirm status." It was the voice of my comms operator, the organist, speaking to me through a microscopic earpiece hidden beneath my carefully styled hair. I felt no bridal jitters, no last-minute nerves, just the cold, sharp focus of a commander in the final moments before H hour. This wasn't a wedding. It was an ambush. The door creaked open and my mother bustled in, her face a mask of forced cheerfulness. She fussed with the veil, her hands trembling slightly. "Oh, Emily, you look so beautiful," she said, her voice bright and brittle. Her eyes, however, wouldn't meet mine in the mirror. They darted around the room, landing everywhere but on my face. "Just Try to make your father proud today, won't you? The words, once capable of wounding me, now felt like nothing more than a final confirmation. They were a dull, familiar echo of a lifetime of misplaced loyalty. I didn't feel pain. I just felt the last embers of hope for her finally turn to ash. My resolve hardened into something unbreakable. Through the slightly ajar door, I watched my father make his grand entrance. He didn't walk into the church as the father of the bride. He strode in like a conquering general reviewing his troops. He nodded condescendingly to the guests, shook hands with the mayor and a few city councilmen, his chest puffed out with self-importance. He was completely oblivious to the fact that the polite catering staff he breezed past were two of the most lethal operators in the U.S. Army. His gaze swept over the videographer in the front, Ghost, and dismissed him with a contemptuous glance. He had no idea that the professional-grade camera lens was not just capturing memories, it was gathering evidence. My father's arrogance had always been his defining trait, but today it was also his fatal flaw. It made him blind. It made him the perfect prey. Finally, the moment came. My father appeared at the door of the bridal chamber to perform his duty, to walk his only daughter down the aisle. It was a hallowed tradition, a symbol of a father's love and protection. For us, it was the final move in a deadly chess game. He took my arm, his grip surprisingly firm, proprietary. We stood together in the narthex. The massive oak doors of the sanctuary closed before us, shutting out the expectant murmurs of the guests and the soft prelude from the organ. In this small enclosed space, his presence was suffocating. He leaned in close, his breath smelling of expensive bourbon and something sour. His voice, a venomous whisper meant only for me, coiled in my ear. After today, you're finally going to learn your place, girl. You should have listened to me from the start. And then he leaned back and kissed my cheek. It wasn't a kiss of fatherly affection. It was cold, dry, a seal of ownership, a final brand of his contempt upon my skin. The kiss of Judas. That was it. That was the last straw. The final unforgivable insult delivered in the very threshold of the church, moments before he was to present me to my future husband. For him, it was a declaration of his ultimate victory. For me, it was the green light, the signal to execute. I didn't flinch. I didn't pull away. I held his gaze, my own expression a placid mask. I gave a slight, almost imperceptible squeeze to the bouquet of white roses in my hands, feeling the tiny, powerful microphone hidden deep within the stems. It was active. Everything was in place. Then, the deep, resonant chords of the pipe organ began to swell, the sound vibrating through the stone floor. The great oak doors swung open. Every head in the church turned. A sea of faces, some smiling, some weeping with joy. But I only saw one. At the far end of the long aisle, standing before the altar, was Liam. His face was lit with an expression of such pure, unadulterated love that it momentarily stole my breath. In his eyes, I saw our future. I saw the peace I had fought so hard in so many ways to find. For one fleeting, beautiful second, I felt it. The quiet, profound serenity I'd always craved. But I knew it was just the calm before the storm. This sacred aisle was not a path to my husband. It was my battlefield. And with my enemy's arm linked through mine, I took the first step forward. Each step was measured, steady, unwavering. The game was on. This is the moment everything changes. If you believe that a person's worth is defined by their own actions, not by the judgment of others, please hit the like button for Emily. And in the comments, type one word, walk. Let's walk this path with her. We stood before the altar, Liam's hand holding mine tightly. The scent of lilies and old prayer books filled the air. The minister smiled warmly, his voice echoing slightly in the vast vaulted space of St. Michael's. He reached the pivotal moment in the ceremony, the ancient words hanging in the air. If anyone has just cause why these two should not be joined together in holy matrimony, let them speak now, or forever, hold their peace. The silence that followed was shattered. The great oak doors at the back of the church burst open with a deafening crash. Sunlight streamed in, silhouetting a team of men clad in black tactical gear, rifles held at the ready. Panic erupted. Guests screamed, ducking behind the pews. The organist, my man on comms, let out a single, discordant note that shrieked through the sanctuary before falling silent. Liam instinctively moved to shield me, his body a warm, solid wall in front of mine. But I didn't move. I stood perfectly still. From the front pew, my father rose to his feet. His face was not one of fear or confusion. It was illuminated with pure, unadulterated triumph. This was his moment. This was the culmination of his grand plan to reclaim his authority, to put me back in my place. He was the director of this play, and the final act had just begun. He pointed a shaking, accusatory finger directly at me, his voice booming with righteous fury, a performance for the ages. "Did you really think I wouldn't find out about your lies?" he roared, his voice bouncing off the stone walls. He then turned his command to the advancing tactical team. "Arrest the bride." He truly believed it was the greatest moment of his life, the instant he finally reclaimed his stolen legacy. The armed men, who he thought were loyal Charleston police officers acting on his command, advanced down the aisle, their boots echoing like hammer blows on the flagstone floor. I looked past Liam's shoulder, my eyes locking directly with my father's. I saw the smug satisfaction in his gaze, the certainty of his victory. And in that moment, I felt nothing but a profound, cold pity for him. I let the dramatic silence hang in the air for a few heartbeats, allowing him to savor his moment of glory. I wanted him to feel the absolute peak of his power just before I took it all away. Then, slowly, deliberately, I raised my bouquet of white roses to my lips. Speaking into the tiny microphone hidden within, my voice cut through the terrified silence of the church. It was not a shout. It was a clear, calm, and lethally sharp whisper. "Nightingale." The effect was instantaneous. It was absolute. The advancing tactical team froze mid-stride as if a switch had been flipped. Then, as one, they pivoted. A 180-degree turn, executed with the flawless, synchronized precision of elite soldiers. Their weapons, which had been vaguely pointed in my direction, were now aimed squarely at one man, my father. The triumphant smirk on Robert Carter's face faltered. It froze, then cracked, then completely shattered. His eyes widened, darting from the armed men to me and back again. Confusion warred with disbelief, and then a wave of dawning, sheer terror washed over his features as the horrifying truth crashed down upon him. He was not the hunter. He was the prey. And he had walked directly, arrogantly, into a trap he never even saw. A figure rose from the second pew, where the most distinguished guests were seated. It was Colonel Miller. He was no longer the unassuming family friend. He was a commanding officer, radiating an aura of absolute authority that filled the vast church. He strode to the front, his footsteps measured and heavy. He stopped directly in front of my father, his voice ringing out with the cold, hard clarity of a judge passing sentence. "Robert Carter," he declared, his voice leaving no room for argument. "You are under arrest for abuse of authority and the unauthorized access of a federal database." My mother let out a strangled cry, a sound of pure disbelief. "Robert, what is this? This is a mistake." But it was no mistake. Ghost detached himself from his position near the side wall. He set his video camera down on a pew, the red recording light still blinking, and calmly approached my father. From his belt, he produced a pair of gleaming, standard-issue steel handcuffs. "You have the right to remain silent," Ghost said, his voice flat, emotionless, reciting the familiar words of the Miranda warning. The entire church held its breath. The air was thick with shock and a tension so palpable you could almost taste it. The grand, powerful illusion that was Robert Carter, former police commissioner, patriarch, and tyrant, had just been publicly and irrevocably shattered into a million pieces. His kingdom had crumbled, and I was the one who had brought it down. My father stood frozen between two soldiers, the steel of the handcuffs a stark, brutal reality against the tailored cuffs of his expensive suit. It was my mother who finally broke the spell, her voice a high-pitched, piercing shriek of denial that seemed to desecrate the sacred silence of the church. "What has he done? This is a mistake. You don't understand. He's Robert Carter," she cried, lunging forward as if to physically shield him, her words grasping for an authority his name no longer held. The soldiers flanking him didn't even flinch. Colonel Miller stepped forward, his calm authority acting as a bulwark against her rising hysteria. "There is no mistake, Mrs. Carter," he said, his voice resonating with a finality that brooked no argument. As he spoke, a soft mechanical whirring sound drew every eye upward toward the ornate chancel arch above the altar. The entire congregation watched, mesmerized, as a large motorized projection screen, normally used for hymn lyrics and scripture verses, descended silently from its hidden recess in the ceiling. It hummed to life, the stark white light cutting through the dim, reverent atmosphere of the church. But instead of displaying romantic photos of Liam and me, or a welcoming message for our guests, it showed the cold, official interface of a government computer system. Bold, white letters materialized against a deep blue background, a chilling and unmistakable seal of power. FBI, Cyber Division. A collective gasp, a sound like the wind being sucked out of the room, rippled through the pews. This was no longer just a shocking family drama playing out in a house of worship. This had escalated into something far more serious, something official and federal. My mother's desperate protest died in her throat, her hands flying to her mouth. The screen in front of us transitioned, displaying a digital log file. The text was small, but the headings were clear, damning, and designed to be understood by everyone. The primary heading read, "Unauthorized Access Log. Charleston PD Secure Database." Colonel Miller's voice, amplified slightly by the church's acoustics, narrated the evidence as it appeared on screen, his tone as dispassionate as if he were reading a field report. On May 17th, at precisely 11:42 p.m., a remote login was initiated using the credentials of a retired police officer, one Michael Jennings. The name of one of my father's oldest and most loyal cronies hung in the air, next to a timestamp that corresponded directly with the night of our engagement party. Beside it, the name of the file that was accessed, highlighted in red, Thompson, Liam R. Pending investigation. The ghost file, the bait, the trap. The user then accessed a flagged file containing sensitive, albeit fabricated, information. Miller continued, his voice a steady, relentless drumbeat of facts. This action immediately triggered a silent alert to our cybercrimes unit in Quantico, as well as the CPD's Internal Affairs Division. My father, finally finding his voice, began to bluster. His face, already flushed with anger, deepened to a dangerous, apoplectic shade of crimson. This is fabricated nonsense. It's entrapment. That's not my login. You can't prove a thing." "We are aware that is not your login, Mr. Carter," Miller said calmly, his gaze unblinking. "The case against Officer Jennings will be handled separately. We are, however, interested in the phone call that prompted his illegal search. Please direct your attention back to the screen." And then, the audio icon on the screen pulsed. A sound file began to play. The church's state-of-the-art speakers, designed to carry a pastor's gentle sermon and the angelic notes of the choir, now broadcast my father's voice. It was raw, unfiltered, and saturated with the casual, arrogant authority he was so used to wielding. "I don't care how you do it, Mike," his voice boomed through the sanctuary, unmistakable and utterly damning. "Just get me something on the kid. Anything. I want to know everything about him before he marries my daughter." There was a pause and then a low, conspiratorial chuckle. "Let's just say I want to be prepared for my wedding toast." A wave of shocked murmurs and sharp intakes of breath swept through the church. The evidence was absolute, irrefutable. The crime, the conspiracy to commit it, and the petty, vindictive motive, all laid bare for every one of his friends, colleagues, and family members to hear. There was nowhere left for him to hide. Ghost, who had retrieved his camera, was no longer filming the wide shot of the chaotic scene. The lens was now zoomed in, a tight, merciless close-up on my father's face. In that moment, the entire church, every guest, every person he had ever lorded his power over, witnessed the complete and utter implosion of Robert Carter. I watched him, my perspective shifting from that of a participant to a clinical observer. I saw the initial blustering rage on his face curdle into slack-jawed confusion. I saw that confusion morph into a dawning, horrifying recognition as he heard his own voice, his own words, condemning him beyond any hope of denial. His eyes darted frantically from the screen to Colonel Miller, then to me. And in them, I saw the final, devastating realization. He didn't just see the evidence against him. He saw the architect behind it all. He saw the entire brilliant, ruthless campaign orchestrated by the very daughter he had dismissed as a worthless, paper-pushing clerk. He seemed to physically shrink inside his expensive suit. The powerful, imposing figure of the former commissioner, the proud patriarch of the Carter family, vanished. He was replaced by a pathetic, cornered old man, exposed not as a fallen hero, but as a common criminal caught in his own petty web of deceit. He looked small. He looked defeated. The soldiers began to lead him away. As they passed the front pew where I stood with Liam, he stopped, his body rigid. He turned his head and locked his eyes on me. They burned with a toxic, impotent mixture of pure hatred and utter disbelief. He was searching my face for something. Triumph, tears, a daughter's gloating victory. He found none of it. I simply looked back at him, my expression a carefully constructed blank. My heart wasn't pounding with glee. It was still. The war was over. The objective had been achieved. There was nothing left to feel but the vast empty space where a father's love should have been. He opened his mouth, a guttural sound forming in his throat, but no words came out. The soldiers gently but firmly pulled him along, escorting him down the long aisle he had so arrogantly strode down just minutes before. My mother, her face a mess of tears and mascara, stumbled after them. The great oak doors of the church swung shut behind them, the sound echoing with a heavy, profound finality. And then there was silence. Not the shocked, panicked silence from before. This was a different kind of quiet. It was the deep, unshakable silence that comes only after the truth, in all its brutal and cleansing clarity, has finally been revealed. The heavy silence that fell after my father was escorted out was a vacuum, pulling all the air and sound from the historic church. The guests sat frozen in their pews, a sea of shocked faces. The minister looked utterly lost, his Bible held limply in his hands. It was a moment suspended in time, the aftermath of a detonation. Then Colonel Miller, who had returned to his seat, broke the spell. He stood up, and in the profound quiet, his voice was a clear, steady beacon. He turned to the bewildered minister. "Apologies for the interruption, Pastor. Please, continue with the ceremony." His words were an order, a return to normalcy, a declaration that the darkness had passed and the light was being reclaimed. A collective sigh of relief seemed to whisper through the sanctuary. Liam's hand, which had never left mine, tightened its grip. He turned to me, and I braced myself for the questions, the confusion, the shock. Instead, his eyes were clear. There was no doubt in them, no fear, only a look of profound awe and a love so deep it anchored me. "I always knew you were special," he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. "I just never imagined how much." And for the first time that day, a genuine smile touched my lips. It felt like a sunrise after a long, dark night. I felt a wave of lightness, of relief, so pure it was dizzying. I looked over my shoulder. My team, Ghost, Hex, and the others, had removed their tactical helmets and balaclavas. They now stood respectfully along the side aisle, no longer an assault team, but a silent, formidable honor guard. My honor guard. Surrounded by these men, my true brothers in arms, with the love of my life beside me, I turned back to the minister. We exchanged our vows. The ancient words of love, honor, and fidelity took on a new, more powerful meaning. We were not just promising our futures to each other. We were consecrating a new beginning, forged in truth and defended by a family of warriors. The wedding reception was held at a beautiful historic rice mill overlooking the Ashley River. The storm had passed, but the aftershocks were still to come. I knew a final confrontation was inevitable. I found my mother near the veranda, staring out at the water, a champagne flute untouched in her hand. She looked smaller, older. When she saw me, her face crumpled and the accusations began. fueled by grief and a lifetime of denial. "How could you do that to him, Emily?" she sobbed, her voice trembling with rage. "To your own father. He's your family." I looked at her, and the anger I had held for her for so long was simply gone. It had been burned out of me in the crucible of the past few weeks. All I felt was a vast, hollow sadness, a grief for the mother I wished I'd had. "I gave Dad 29 years of chances to be my father, Mom," I said, my voice quiet but firm. 29 years, but he chose to be my enemy. And when the time came to choose, you chose to stand with him. The truth of it hung in the air between us, stark and undeniable. I reached out and gently placed a hand on her shoulder. Her skin felt fragile. "I do love you, Mom. But I cannot let the toxicity of your marriage destroy my life anymore. This is the boundary." She stared at me, speechless. For the first time, she wasn't looking at the disappointing daughter, the difficult child. She was seeing a woman she didn't recognize, a woman who had built a wall of self-respect so high and so strong that she could never breach it again. She finally understood. The daughter she thought was weak had become the one with all the power. Later, as the sun began to set, casting a golden glow over the water, Colonel Miller found me. He raised his glass of whiskey to mine. "I'm proud of you, Major," he said, the words slipping out so naturally that it took me a second to register it. He'd just revealed my upcoming classified promotion. He smiled. "Not just for the flawless execution of the operation today, but for your integrity, for your courage." He looked at me then, not as my commanding officer, but with the warm, genuine pride of a father. "The Carter legacy isn't what your father leaves behind, Emily. It's what you are building right now." His words were the validation I had stopped searching for years ago, but that my heart still desperately needed. They were a balm on a wound that had been open since childhood, finally allowing it to heal. The rest of the evening passed in a warm, happy blur. When it came time for dinner, the head table was a picture of my new reality. The seats traditionally reserved for the parents of the bride were not empty. They were filled. To my left and right, beside Liam and me, sat Colonel Miller, Ghost, Hex, and the rest of my ODA team. The usual stilted wedding conversations were replaced by laughter and camaraderie. They told sanitized stories of missions, of shared hardships in faraway places, their words weaving a tapestry of trust and mutual respect. There were no backhanded compliments, no subtle digs, no suffocating judgment. There was only the easy, unconditional acceptance of my chosen family. I looked around the table at these men, these quiet warriors who had stood with me, who had trusted me with their lives, and today, with my own. I looked at my husband, whose love had been a steady light in my darkest moments. And I realized with a sense of peace so profound it almost made me weep, that I was finally home. Family isn't always about the blood you share. Sometimes it's about the people you bleed with in the trenches. 6 months after the wedding that became a reckoning, I stood on a stage under the hallowed gray arches of West Point. I was no longer Captain Carter, I was Major Carter. And I was addressing a lecture hall filled with young cadets, the future leaders of the U.S. Army. Their faces were a sea of disciplined focus and youthful ambition, reminding me of a version of myself I'd almost forgotten. I was there as a guest lecturer on the topic of ethics in command. And for the first time, I told my story. Not the whole, messy, personal story of a father and a daughter, but the part that mattered, the part that had become my truth. I spoke about honor not as an abstract concept, but as a series of difficult choices. I spoke about integrity and how true loyalty is not to an individual, but to the principles of justice we swear an oath to defend. I told them that the most dangerous enemy they might ever face could be a compromised superior, and that their duty would be to the law, not to the man. My two worlds, the secret life of Valkyrie and the public life of Emily Carter, had finally merged. There were no more lies, no more hidden parts of myself. In the back of the lecture hall, leaning against the far wall, was Liam. He wasn't just my husband, he was my partner, my confidant who now knew everything. He watched me with a quiet pride that was my constant source of strength. I was a soldier, a wife, a leader. I was, finally, completely whole. The fallout from my father's arrest had been significant. Operation Nightingale hadn't just exposed one man's crime, it had pulled a thread that unraveled a wide-ranging web of corruption within the Charleston Police Department. My father's case led to a sweeping federal investigation, resulting in a dozen more arrests, several forced retirements, and a complete overhaul of the department's leadership. The Carter legacy my father was so obsessed with preserving had, in the end, become a necessary purge. His name was now synonymous with disgrace, a cautionary tale whispered in the halls of the very institution he once ruled. He had made his mark on history, just not in the way he had intended. He had become the villain of his own story. Life moved on. A year after our wedding, on a quiet Tuesday afternoon, the mail arrived. Bills, junk mail, a magazine, and one plain white envelope. There was no stamp, just a stark black ink marking from the Federal Correctional Institution in Butner, North Carolina. The return address read, Robert Carter. I held the letter in my hand, feeling the surprising weight of the single sheet of paper inside. A year ago, the sight of this envelope would have sent a jolt of anxiety and anger through me. It would have had the power to ruin my day, to drag me back into the vortex of his toxic influence. But now, standing in the sunlit hallway of my own home, I felt nothing. No anger, no curiosity about what pathetic justifications or venomous accusations might lie within. No lingering pain. The war was over. The battles had been won. He no longer held any power over me. His words were just ink on paper, the meaningless ramblings of a ghost from a life that was no longer mine. Calmly, I walked into my home office, turned on the paper shredder, and fed the unopened letter into the slot. The machine whirred to life, and in a matter of seconds, his final attempt to reach me, to control my emotions, was reduced to a cascade of meaningless, cross-cut confetti. I didn't even watch it finish. I just turned and walked away. I went out into the backyard. It was a perfect autumn afternoon, the air crisp and clean. Our golden retriever, General, was chasing a tennis ball across the lawn, his barks full of goofy, unrestrained joy. Liam was there, laughing as he threw the ball again. He saw me and his smile widened. I walked up behind him and wrapped my arms around his waist, resting my chin on his shoulder. He leaned his head back against mine, and we stood there for a long moment, just watching our dog play, bathed in the warm afternoon sun. This was it. This was the peace I had fought for. Not the tense, adrenaline-fueled quiet before a mission, but the deep, soul-settling tranquility of a life built on truth, love, and a hard-won sense of honor. I finally understood what my grandfather had tried to teach me all those years ago. A true legacy isn't a name carved on a building or a rank pinned to a uniform. It's not something you inherit. A true legacy is the peace you build for yourself, brick by brick, choice by choice. It's the quiet dawn you create with your own two hands. And that is my story. The journey wasn't easy, but the peace I found on the other side was worth every battle. I share this because I know I'm not alone. So many of you have fought your own wars in the places that were supposed to be your sanctuary, and my heart is with you. If you take anything from my experience, let it be this. You are the author of your own legacy. Your honor is defined by your actions, and your peace is the most sacred ground you can ever claim. If my story moved you, please support our channel by liking and subscribing. And in the comments, I'd be honored if you would share one word: legacy. Let's remind each other what we are all building.